There's a difference between how adult birds teach young birds how to fly and the way poultry producers deal with young birds in the agricultural system. When dealing with human beings, the former is a far better approach. Applying the principles of industrial agriculture to students or to the citizenry of a country, well, wouldn't that be immoral? George Orwell thought so. So did C.S. Lewis. These two didn't see eye to eye on everything. George Orwell once wrote a review of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. He said that the book was worth reading, but he also said that on the whole, novels are better when there are no miracles in them. That's not exactly an enthusiastic endorsement, but I've read 1984 a whole bunch of times, and I've read an awful lot of C.S. Lewis. And I can't help but think that had they sat down over a couple of pints, they would have discovered that they agree on a great deal. I don't think I really understood 1984 until I considered it in the light of the Abolition of Man. So that's what this video is about. Well, this one and the next two. It's a reading of George Orwell's 1984 through the lens of The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. The Abolition of Man contains 3 lectures that Lewis gave at King's College, University of Durham. In the first lecture, he argues that the education system of his day was going at it all wrong. Instead of educating the whole person, it was only concerned with educating just one part. Lewis insists that a human being is composed of 3 unified elements. The head is the seat of reason, the chest is the seat of the emotions, where noble sentiments should be cultivated, and the belly, which is the seat of the appetites. This involves hunger, thirst, and sexual desire. Lewis borrows his anthropology from Plato. Plato too describes the human soul, as having 3 parts. There's the rational or intellectual part. It seeks truth, knowledge, and wisdom. Then there's the spirited part of the soul, which is associated with courage and honor and the pursuit of victory. It is the part that reacts to challenges and seeks recognition. And the last part of the human soul is the appetite. This part of the soul is driven by the basic physical desires. To illustrate the relationship between the parts of this tripartite soul, Plato offers an analogy involving a charioteer and 2 horses. Reason is represented by the charioteer, who guides the chariot. Spirit is one of the horses. It represents energy and assertiveness. The appetite is the other horse. It's often depicted as unruly and needing control. The charioteer doesn't provide the control. He leads with the reins. The control is provided by the spirited horse. Without it, the appetitive horse would be uncontrollable. The intervening role of this spirited horse, the human spirit, is so important that Lewis claims it is by this middle element that man is man. For without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. The proper relationship between these 3 elements is necessary for one to be fully human. The head must rule the belly through the chest. Without the chest, the belly will rule the head. Lewis's first lecture is called Men Without Chests. Men Without Chests is the product of an educational system that educates only the mind and deliberately suppresses mere feelings. Lewis insists that the emotions are not necessarily irrational, and therefore not necessarily contemptible. He says that sentiments are reasonable or unreasonable only as they conform or fail to conform to something else. His word for this external standard, to which all sentiments are to be measured, is called the Tao. It is a term borrowed from Chinese philosophy. It describes the universal moral law that transcends personal values and cultural differences. He argues that all cultures generally hold the same things honorable, and the same behaviors to be reprehensible. The Tao is the doctrine of objective value. Lewis argues that the purpose of education is not just to shape the intellect, but also to shape the sentiments. To avoid the abolition of man, then, both human intellect and sentiment must be trained in accordance with the Tao. So what does all this have to do with 1984? Lewis was all critical of the priests of reason, those rationalist educators who loved reason to the exclusion of all else. In George Orwell's 1984, it is the priests of power that threaten humanity. What they value is different, but the principles are still the same. In the novel The Government of Oceania, the party seeks absolute power, but it cannot have absolute power if there is this external objective moral standard out there to which everyone must submit. The party can only get what it wants if it denies the existence of objective reality. But here's the problem according to Lewis. You can't value one piece of the Tao and reject all the rest. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. Either you accept the whole Tao, or you reject the whole thing, and then nothing has value. And then I suppose you fall into the pit of nihilism. What is not an option is to pick one thing and say that it has value and nothing else does. If you do that, then you necessarily submit yourself to animal urges. You just follow your appetites. This is what's going on in 1984. The party values power, it values something. And if it values anything, it has not abandoned the whole Tao, the source of all value. This is what Lewis calls a partial or artificial Tao. The people that impose an artificial Tao are what Lewis calls the conditioners. By stepping outside the Tao, there is no rational reason to retain the portion of the Tao that they have retained, so it can't be justified rationally. If reason has nothing to do with it, then you are guided only by impulse. So we can say of the party in 1984 that it has abandoned the Tao in its quest for power, and in doing so it has stripped its members of their humanity. There is a human being in 1984. Only one. Winston Smith, the protagonist. And he's fighting to hold on to his humanity. He's trying to recover objective value, and he seeks appropriate sentiment. Basically, he's trying to restore the supremacy of the intellect over the animal organism. Orwell considered several titles for his novel. These included The Last Man. In Orwell's dystopia, anyone who is human is a threat to the stability of society. So Winston, the last man, must be cured, and in his rehabilitation, we see the abolition of man. The novel's three-part structure presents the stages of the party's war against humanity. Part 1 shows that every aspect of life under Big Brother is controlled and degraded. Winston's rebellion against the party is tracked in Part 2. And in Part 3, the party reclaims Winston as one of its own. We will look at each stage and how the war was waged on the battlefields of the human mind and heart and body. Since absolute power is the objective of the party, it must necessarily exercise complete control over all aspects of its subjects, the head and the belly and the heart. Let's first look at the party's conquest of the mind. In order to weaken and suppress the intellect, the party imposes elaborate mental training from a very young age, until citizens become adept at doublethink. Doublethink is a system of thought that is at the core of the party's control of the mind. It means to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory, and believing both of them. So you see how doublethink is all about denying objective reality, which is possible when you step outside of the Tao. Winston must use doublethink at his work in the Ministry of Truth. He must accept the fact that the past is alterable, and that it has never been altered, even when he himself is the one who altered it. One of the central tenets of INGSOC, the party's version of English socialism, is the mutability of the past. The motto runs, "Who controls the past, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past." In the absence of the Tao, past events have no objective existence, but survive only in written records and in human memories. So for the party to control the past, it simply needs complete control over the records and over the minds of its members. The records are easily changed, and the human minds are controlled with doublethink. Another way that the party attempts to control all thought is through its project to create a new language called Newspeak. Newspeak is diffused through the Newspeak Dictionary, which is in its 11th edition. Each edition contains fewer words. The express purpose of Newspeak is the destruction of language. The whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. When one is conversant in Newspeak, one's brain need not even be engaged, only the larynx. So doublethink, the mutability of the past, and Newspeak are the ways that the party exerts absolute power over the mind. Now let's turn to the conquest of humanity through the body. The party's subjugation of the body is achieved by degrading the physical experience of all the citizens of Oceania. Look at how the novel starts. Winston's home in the Victory Mansion smells of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. From his apartment window, he views vistas of rotting 19th century houses. The Victory gin he drinks gives off a sickly, oily smell, and when swallowed, it gives one the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The stew at work is a filthy mess that had the appearance of vomit. The party deprives its citizens of all physical comfort. And then there's the constant threat of punishment and torture. These two things combined set the body against the self. Winston says that your worst enemy was your own nervous system. And at the moment of crisis, one is never fighting against an external enemy, but always against one's own body. The party makes sure that there is a perpetual battle with the body by keeping its subjects in a constant state of crisis, so that the body swells up to fill the universe. And even when you are not paralyzed by fright or screaming in pain, life is a moment-to-moment struggle against hunger or cold or sleeplessness, against a sour stomach or an aching tooth. What Winston is saying is that in this constant state of crisis, the body rules over reason. Just as the mind and the body are controlled in Oceania, so too is the chest. As Lewis said, it is by this element, the trained sentiment, that we are human. And the party knows this too, so they attempt to twist the sentiment in all kinds of anti-Tao directions. O'Brien, the spokesman for the party, explicitly expresses the party's disdain for the Tao, or in his words, the values of old civilizations which were founded on love or justice. He says, "Ours is founded on hatred. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Consequently, the precepts of the Tao, like beneficence and duties to parents and children, are completely unacceptable. These relationships are distorted so that the energies that one would normally put into them are channeled to Big Brother, the party's figurehead." There's no such thing as friendship in Oceania. Winston has a friend named Syme, but he immediately clarifies that perhaps friend was not exactly the right word. You did not have friends nowadays. When Syme asks Winston if he has any razor blades, Winston, with guilty haste, says that he doesn't, even though he's hoarding two. The whole system is designed to drive a wedge between people. In its attack on the Tao, the party also seeks to distort and exploit the powerful emotions associated with family. While Winston helps his neighbor, Mrs. Parsons, with her plugged sink, he muses on family. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by means of such organizations as the spies, they were systematically turned into ungovernable savages. And yet this produced in them no tendency whatever to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party and everything connected with it. With loyalty channeled away from parents toward the party and Big Brother, parents lived in fear of their own children. And with good reason. Eavesdropping children regularly denounced their parents to the thought police. And marriage? Wow. The marriage relationship is a particular threat to Big Brother because of the power of physical attraction that can lead to love. Rather than attempt to eradicate love, the party uses its emotional energy for its own purposes. There's the Junior Anti-Sex League, which ensures that young people have no sexual outlet. From an early age, they are taught that sex within marriage isn't any fun at all. Sexual intercourse was to be looked upon as a highly disgusting minor operation like having an enema. And then there's the 2 minutes hate, the transformation of sexual energy away from love toward hatred and loyalty to Big Brother. On a daily basis, Winston gathers with his co-workers to work themselves into a frenzy of hate. For Winston, among other things, this is a rechanneling of bottled-up sexual energy. During the 2 minutes hate, Winston envisions himself flogging the attractive dark-haired girl with a club, tying her up naked, shooting her full of arrows, and slitting her throat at the moment of climax. This conditioning occasionally fails to completely channel sexual energy toward Big Brother, but it's not a threat if the sexual expression is adequately degraded. Winston reflects on a time that he visited a prostitute, which is officially illegal, but nothing is ever really done about it. Even when he realizes that she was old and toothless, he went ahead and did it just the same. He is revolted by this memory. This is exactly what the party wants. Sex is a very powerful impulse, and if the party can't adequately control it, then the next best thing is to degrade it to a degree that it's no longer a factor. Because sexual expression is degraded, so too are the feelings associated with it. Consequently, the subjects never experience proper sentiments in relationships, those consistent with the Tao. Part 1 represents life under the rule of the party. Through the training of the head, the chest, and the belly of its subjects, the party is very close to having absolute power. Orwell is obviously critical of this whole approach. So is Lewis. In the context of education, Lewis makes a comparison between the old way of doing things in accordance with the Tao and the new rationalist way of doing things with an artificial Tao. He says this: where the old initiated, the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. In 1984, Winston resists this conditioning, and this is the subject of Part 2. Thank you, and we will see you there.